Welcome to Motivational Humanity. You are not alone.
She smiled at everyone in that room. She remembered every birthday. She made sure the coffee was hot, the house was warm, the calendar was full of everyone else's appointments. She knew exactly what her daughter liked in her salad, exactly how her husband took his tea, exactly which topics to avoid at Thanksgiving so nobody's feelings got hurt. She knew everyone, and nobody really knew her. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not rush past it, not nod politely and keep scrolling. I want you to feel it. Because if some quiet part of you just recognized herself in those words, then what I'm about to share with you matters more than I can say in a single breath. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside. It doesn't look like sitting alone in a dark room. It doesn't look like having no one to call. In fact, it often looks like the opposite. It looks like a full house, a busy phone, a woman who is needed, wanted, relied upon, celebrated even, and yet somewhere beneath all of that beautiful noise, she's whispering to herself, is this all there is? Does anyone actually see me? That whisper, that quiet, almost embarrassing whisper, that's what we're here to talk about today. You've spent decades being the person who holds things together, the glue, the anchor, the one people call when they don't know who else to call. And you did it well. Lord, you did it well. You loved fiercely. You sacrificed quietly. You showed up even when you were running on empty, even when your own heart was sitting in a corner somewhere, waiting patiently to be noticed. And somewhere along the way, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way a river reshapes a canyon, you started editing yourself. You stopped mentioning the dream you used to have. You stopped correcting people when they misunderstood you. You laughed at the right moments, softened your opinions, made yourself smaller, not because you were weak, God no, but because keeping the peace felt like love, because taking up space felt selfish, because somewhere, somehow, you learned that being needed was safer than being known. That's the weight we carry. And most of us have been carrying it so long, we've forgotten it's even there. I'm not talking to you as someone who has it all figured out. I'm talking to you as someone who spent years, being the most helpful, most present, most accommodating version of herself she could possibly be, and woke up one morning feeling like a stranger in her own life. Like she'd been such a devoted understudy to everyone else's story that she'd forgotten she was supposed to have one of her own. There's a term in psychology, and I don't want to make this feel clinical because it isn't, it's human, called self-concept erosion. It's what happens when we've spent so long defining ourselves through our relationships, our roles, our usefulness to others, that we genuinely lose track of who we are apart from all of that. Not who we are to our children, not who we are to our partners or our friends or our communities, but who we are when the house is quiet, when no one needs anything, when there's no role to perform. For a lot of women, especially women in this chapter of life, this rich, complicated, often disorienting chapter between 55 and 75, that silence is the most terrifying thing they've ever faced. Because in that silence, something starts to surface. Something that has been waiting patiently with extraordinary grace for you to finally have a moment to listen. Yourself. Not the self that learned to say, I'm fine, before anyone even asked. Not the self that absorbed other people's moods like a sponge and called it empathy. Not the self that shrunk, but the original one. The one who had opinions and fire and a laugh that came from somewhere deep. The one who used to know, with a quiet certainty, what she loved and what she stood for and what she simply would not tolerate. She didn't disappear. She's been in there this whole time, living in the sanctuary of your unlived moments. Speaking in quiet whispers you may have mistaken for restlessness or longing, or, as some women tell me, a midlife crisis that arrived a decade or two fashionably late. It isn't a crisis, it's a calling. It didn't happen overnight. That's the first thing I want you to understand, and I want you to understand it not just intellectually, not just as a thing you nod at, but in your bones. Because so many women sit across from me, or write to me, or pull me aside after a talk, and they say some version of the same thing. I don't even know when it happened. I just looked up one day and didn't recognize myself. And there's a particular grief in that. A disorienting, almost shameful grief. Because how do you mourn something you can't point to? There was no single moment, No dramatic event, no villain, just a slow, quiet drift, like falling asleep on a boat and waking up miles from the shore you remember. So let's trace it back, gently, without judgment, because you deserve to understand the why, not so you can assign blame, but so you can finally stop assigning it to yourself. It started, for most of us, so much earlier than we realize. Think back. Not to your marriage, not to your children, not to the career you chose or the one that chose you. Go further back. Go back to the little girl who learned, through 1,000 tiny experiments, what got her love and what got her silence. Maybe she learned that being helpful earned her smiles. That having big emotions made the adults around her uncomfortable. That speaking up created tension, but smoothing things over created peace. And peace felt like safety, and safety felt like love, and love was the whole point, wasn't it? So she adapted, as children do, as brilliant, sensitive, perceptive children do. She learned to read the room before she read her own heart. She learned to ask, what does everyone need? Before she ever thought to ask, what do I need? Psychologists call this anxious accommodation. I call it the beginning of the long edit. And then life handed her more reasons to keep editing. Maybe it was a relationship, early on, where her needs were consistently treated as inconveniences, where she learned that expressing what she truly wanted led to conflict, and conflict led to disconnection, and disconnection was simply unbearable. So she tucked her needs away neatly, told herself she didn't really mind, told herself she was being mature, being flexible, being easy to love. Maybe it was motherhood, that staggering, gorgeous, consuming arrival of someone who needed everything from her. And she gave it, freely, willingly, with her whole heart. But somewhere in those sleepless years, a subtle internal message took root: your needs come last. Not because anyone said it cruelly, but because biology demanded it, circumstance reinforced it, and culture celebrated it. We gave awards to women who gave themselves away. We called it devotion. We called it strength. We built entire identities around it. And she believed it. Because the alternative, believing that she also mattered, that her inner life also deserved tending, felt like the most dangerous kind of selfishness. There's a concept I return to again and again, one that the psychologist Carl Rogers wrote about with such tenderness, called conditions of worth. The idea is heartbreakingly simple. From the time we are very small, we absorb messages from parents, from culture, from religion, from the people whose love we cannot afford to lose, about what we must be in order to deserve love. Be agreeable, be useful, be pretty but not vain, be smart but not threatening, be strong but not too strong, be giving, be patient, be good. And we internalize these conditions so deeply, so early, that we stop experiencing them as external rules. They become our inner voice. They become what we mistake for our conscience, our values, our character, when really, they are simply the cage we built to keep ourselves safe inside someone else's comfort. For many women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, this is the unspoken truth that sits at the center of everything. I have spent my life being who I needed to be, and I'm no longer sure who that is underneath. And then something shifts. It might be retirement, that sudden, disorienting removal of a role that gave you structure and identity for 30 years. It might be the children leaving, the nest going quiet in a way that feels less like freedom and more like standing in a room where all the furniture has been moved, and you can't quite remember where things used to go. It might be loss. The death of a parent, even an imperfect one, that severs the last thread of the child you used to be and leaves you standing there, suddenly and strangely as the oldest generation, the one at the front of the line now. It might be illness, your own or someone you love. That ruthless auditor that arrives without an appointment and starts asking questions you've been successfully avoiding for years. Is this the life I meant to live? Is there still time? Or it might be quieter than any of that. It might just be a random Tuesday afternoon, the house still, the to-do list done, and you sitting in a chair by the window, a cup of tea going cold beside you, with this strange, floating feeling that you can't quite name. Who am I when there's nothing left to do for anyone? That question isn't a symptom of something wrong with you. That question is the most important one you've ever asked. Because here's what I know, not as a theory, but as a truth I've watched transform women's lives at 58, at 67, at 7 and 3. The self doesn't actually erode. It doesn't dissolve. It doesn't disappear into all those years of giving and accommodating and showing up for everyone else. It waits, with a patience that honestly should embarrass the rest of us. It waits in the things that make you catch your breath unexpectedly. A piece of music, a landscape, a line in a book that makes you put it down and stare at the ceiling because something in you just went yes. It waits in the flicker of irritation you quickly suppress when someone dismisses you. It waits in the dream you still have, the one you've probably never told anyone about in its full, unedited form. Because somewhere, you stopped believing you were allowed to want things that big. The self is in there. She's been in there all along. And she has been sending you signals for years. You just needed someone to help you learn how to read them again. There's a moment, not a dramatic one necessarily, not a lightning bolt, not the kind of awakening that makes for a tidy story with a clear before and after. For most women, it's quieter than that. Almost embarrassingly quiet, given the magnitude of what it sets in motion. Maybe it happens in a bathroom mirror. You're brushing your teeth, doing the same thing you've done 10,000 times before, and you catch your own eyes, really catch them, and for just a fraction of a second, before the day rushes back in and reclaims you, you think, I have no idea what I actually want anymore. Maybe it happens at a dinner table. Everyone is talking, laughing, and you're nodding in the right places, refilling glasses, keeping the warmth in the room, and suddenly, as if from a great distance, you hear yourself laugh at something you don't actually find funny. And something very small, very tired, and very honest inside you thinks, I am performing. I have been performing for so long I can't remember when I stopped being genuine. Maybe it happens in grief, or in a doctor's office, or in the jarring, unexpected freedom of an empty house. However it arrives, that moment is not a breakdown. It is a breakthrough wearing a breakdown's clothes. Here's what I want you to understand about that moment, because the way you interpret it will determine everything that comes next. Most women, when that crack of awareness opens up, do one of two things. They panic and plaster over it. They get busier. They find a new person to take care of. They volunteer more. They redecorate. They do anything to avoid standing in that terrifying open space. Or they feel ashamed of it. They think, what's wrong with me? I have a good life. I have people who love me. Who am I to feel lost? And I want to take that shame gently by the shoulders and look it in the eye and say, you are not lost because your life isn't good enough. You are lost because you are human and you have been carrying more than your share for longer than you should have, without ever being told that you were allowed to put some of it down. There is nothing wrong with you. There is something right with you. Something stubbornly, beautifully alive in you that is finally refusing to be quiet anymore. So what does coming home to yourself actually look like? I want to be careful here because this is the part where so many well-meaning conversations go wrong. They hand you a list, 10 steps, 5 habits, a morning routine, as if the self you've been missing is a problem to be optimized rather than a relationship to be rebuilt. Rebuilding a relationship takes something different. It takes time. It takes attention. And more than anything, it takes what I think of as radical curiosity, a willingness to approach yourself not with judgment, not with a self-improvement agenda, but with the same gentle, genuine interest you would offer a dear friend you hadn't seen in years. Think about what that would look like. If a woman you loved deeply, someone who had been through everything, who had given so much of herself away, if she came and sat across from you, you wouldn't hand her a worksheet. You wouldn't tell her to meditate for 20 minutes every morning. You would lean in. You would ask her questions. You would listen, really listen, without rushing her toward a resolution. That is what you owe yourself now. Start with the questions no one ever thinks to ask. Not, what should I do with my life? That one's too big, too loaded, too terrifying to answer honestly at first. Start smaller. Start almost embarrassingly small. What do I actually enjoy? Not what I'm supposed to enjoy, not what photographs well, not what makes me seem interesting, but what genuinely, privately brings me pleasure. For some women, they realize they don't actually know, and that realization lands hard. But it is also, I promise you, one of the most honest and therefore hopeful moments available to a human being, because you cannot find your way back to something until you're willing to admit you've drifted from it. So you start noticing. You start paying attention to your own reactions with the same careful attention you've always paid to everyone else's. You notice what makes time disappear. You notice what makes your shoulders drop. You notice the quiet whispers, that flicker of yes, that pull toward something you can't quite name yet. And instead of dismissing them as impractical or selfish or too late, you follow them, even a small step, even just enough to say, I see you. I'm listening now. I want to tell you about something that happens in therapy, in real deep, unglamorous therapy, that I think is more powerful than almost anything else I've witnessed in my work. It's the moment when a woman, usually somewhere in this chapter of life, finally allows herself to say out loud the things she has never said. Not the version she's edited for palatability. Not the version that makes her seem reasonable and measured. The real version. The one she's been swallowing for years. Sometimes it's anger. I gave and gave and gave, and I was never once asked what I needed. Sometimes it's grief. I made choices I thought were right, and I'm only now understanding what they cost me. Sometimes it's something smaller and more tender. A dream she gave up so long ago, she'd almost convinced herself she'd wanted to give it up. And when she finally says it, out loud in actual words, in the hearing of another human being who doesn't flinch, something extraordinary happens. She doesn't fall apart. She comes together. Because the self that has been waiting all this time doesn't need you to have it all figured out. It doesn't need you to arrive with a plan or an apology or a promise to do better. It just needs you to show up, to stop leaving yourself out of the rooms you walk into, to stop editing your truth before anyone even asks for it. This is the turning point, right here. Not a dramatic reinvention, not a radical departure from everything you've built, but a quiet, revolutionary act of inclusion, including yourself in your own life, letting your preferences matter, letting your feelings be named, letting the unspoken truths finally find some air. And yes, it will feel uncomfortable at first. It will feel selfish. That word again, that loyal little guardian that has kept you small and safe for so many years. But I want you to consider something. Selfish is taking without regard for others. What you are learning to do is simply exist with regard for yourself. That's not selfishness. That's the foundation of every truly generous life. Because the women I have watched do this work, the ones who found their way back to themselves in their 60s, their late 50s, even their early 70s, they didn't become less loving. They didn't abandon their families or stop caring about the people who needed them. They became more present, more honest, more genuinely warm. Not the performed warmth of a woman running on obligation, but the real warmth of a woman who has finally given herself permission to also be in the room. Their relationships deepened. Their friendships became more nourishing and less draining. They stopped attracting people who only needed them and started connecting with people who actually saw them. And perhaps most importantly, they stopped being afraid of their own quiet, because in that quiet, they had finally found someone worth staying for. Themselves. I want to tell you something that took me a long time to believe. Not because it's complicated. Not because it requires any special wisdom or years of study or a particular kind of courage. But because we live in a world that has spent a very long time convincing women, especially women who have arrived at this particular, magnificent, underestimated chapter of life, that the story is mostly behind them, that the best parts have already happened, that what comes now is maintenance, management, the quiet, dignified work of winding down. I want you to know, in the marrow of your bones, in the place where your truest knowing lives, that this is one of the most profound lies ever told. What is actually happening right now, in this season of your life, is something that most cultures outside of our own have always understood and honored. The indigenous traditions knew it. The ancient wisdom lineages knew it. Even modern psychology, when it's being its most honest self, knows it. This is not the winding down. This is the coming into. There is a version of you that could not have existed at 35. She didn't have the scar tissue yet. She hadn't yet survived the things that taught her what she was actually made of. She hadn't yet sat with enough loss to understand that impermanence isn't the enemy, that it's actually the thing that makes presence precious. She hadn't yet lived long enough to know the difference between what other people told her mattered and what she discovered, through the long and sometimes brutal education of lived experience actually matters. That woman, the one reading these words right now, she is not the rough draft. She is the most fully realized version yet. But here's the tender part, the part I want to sit with you in for just a moment. Coming home to yourself at this stage doesn't mean everything will suddenly be easy. It doesn't mean the relationships that have been complicated will untangle overnight. It doesn't mean the grief you carry for the years spent smaller than you deserve to be, for the dreams that got quietly folded away, for the version of yourself you're only now meeting properly. It doesn't mean that grief will simply dissolve. It won't. And that's okay. Because grief, when it belongs to something real, is not a sign that you've failed. It's a sign that you loved, even when the thing you loved most was a self you didn't yet know how to protect. You can mourn those years without being imprisoned by them. You can look at who you were, that exhausted, giving, quietly disappearing woman, and feel tenderness for her rather than resentment. She did what she knew how to do. She loved the best way she had been taught. She kept everyone safe, including you, in the only way she understood at the time. She deserves your compassion. She is you. So what do you do now? Not as a checklist, not as a self-improvement project, but genuinely, what does it look like to live from this point forward? As a woman who has decided to include herself in her own story, I think it starts with a single, almost laughably simple commitment. You stop leaving yourself out of the conversation. Not just the conversations you have with other people, though yes, those too, but the conversation you have with yourself. In the sanctuary of your own mind 1,000 times a day, the moment you catch yourself thinking, I shouldn't want that, you pause. You get curious. You ask, you says who. The moment you feel that familiar pull to shrink, to soften, to edit the fullest version of your truth into something more digestible for the people around you, you notice it. You don't have to fight it. You just have to see it. Awareness in this work is not a small thing. Awareness is everything, because you cannot reclaim what you cannot see. And the moment you start to see, really see, the patterns that have kept you performing instead of living, something quietly irreversible begins to happen. Like a window being opened in a room that has been closed for too long. You can't unbreathe that fresh air. You can't go back to not noticing. And you won't want to. I want to speak now to the fear. Because it's there, I know it's there, sitting just beneath all of this hope like a loyal, worried companion. The fear that says it's too late. The fear that says the people in my life won't understand, won't adjust, won't love the version of me that takes up more space. The fear that says, who am I, after all this time, to suddenly decide I matter? I want to answer that last one directly, because it's the one that breaks my heart the most. Who are you to decide you matter? You are a woman who has spent decades proving, through 10,000 acts of quiet devotion, that you understand what it means to love something fiercely enough to sacrifice for it. You have loved your children that way, your partners, your friends, your communities. You have loved other people's lives into flourishing with your own two hands. You are simply being asked now to turn even a fraction of that ferocious love inward, not instead of loving others, in addition to it. That's not radical. That's not selfish. That's not too late. That is perhaps the most important work of your life. And as for the people who might struggle with your becoming, the ones who have grown comfortable with the version of you that never asked for anything, that always made herself convenient, that kept her wild edges smoothed down so everyone else could feel at ease. Some of them will surprise you. Some of the people you were most afraid to be honest with will lean in when you finally show up as yourself. Will exhale, even as if they'd been waiting for permission to meet the real you. Relationships that felt thin and transactional will find unexpected depth when you stop performing and start being. And some people won't adjust. Some people have built their comfort on your smallness, and your expansion will unsettle them. And that will be painful. I won't dress it up otherwise. But here is what I have watched again and again in the lives of women who chose themselves at this stage. The love that remains when you are fully yourself is the only love that was ever really yours. Everything else was just an arrangement. You are not starting over. Please hear that. You are not dismantling what you've built. You are not abandoning who you've been. Every single thing you've lived, every sacrifice, every adaptation, every quiet morning where you got up and showed up even when you were running on nothing. All of it is in you. All of it has made you someone with extraordinary depth, extraordinary capacity, extraordinary wisdom that you may not even fully see yet because you've been too busy using it in service of everyone else. You are taking all of that, every year of it, and you are finally bringing it home to yourself. This is not the epilogue of your story. This is the chapter where the most interesting thing happens, where the woman who has been holding everything together discovers that she was always the most remarkable thing in the room, and she just hadn't been looking in the right direction. She was looking outward, always outward, for the signal that she was enough. And now, at last, she's learning to look inward, into that quiet sanctuary that has been waiting, patient and undiminished all this time. She's learning to hear the quiet whispers not as restlessness, not as ingratitude, not as crisis, but as the sound of her own soul, clearing its throat after years of polite silence and preparing to finally say something true. Let her speak. After all this time, let her speak. And when she does, when you do, I hope you'll find that she sounds exactly like someone you've always known, someone you've missed, someone you are so profoundly, relievedly glad to have back. Welcome home.